Good afternoon. By way of introduction, my name is Bernice Amit and I am an audit executive at Thornton. We apologize for the slight delay, but the previous session was really interesting and it took a bit longer than expected. Today I will be the moderator for this webinar, whereby we will be discussing the topic of open spaces within neighborhoods. As many of you may be aware, the economic implications and repercussions brought about by the COVID-19 global pandemic are deep and far-reaching, affecting the economy of virtually every nation around the world. No one was or is immune to this pandemic, and this can be seen from the after effects and the ongoing effects brought about by the pandemic. The virus has got severe disruptions across various sectors from both the demand side and the supply side. And of course, Malta is no exception to this. First and foremost, with great pleasure, I welcome our panelists who have decided to join us in this discussion today. We have with us Ms. Michelle Borge, who is the unit manager at the Planning Authority. Ms. Borge is a geographer and a marine resource manager by training, as well as a psychology graduate with over 25 years of experience in policy development for spatial planning and environmental management. She holds the position of a manager for the Green and Blue Development Unit at the Planning Authority, which seeks to mainstream sustainable development in spatial planning and also coordinate work on the maritime spatial planning. Also joining us on the panel today is Dr. Elizabeth Conrad, who is a senior lecturer at the Institute of Earth Systems at the University of Malta and an adjunct assistant professor within the Department of Integrated Science and Technology at James Madison University, Virginia. Dr. Conrad worked in both public and private sectors in fields related to environmental management locally, and remains actively involved as a practitioner in the field of environmental impact assessment, with a particular interest in areas relating to nature connectedness, protected areas, and management of landscapes. Finally, our third panelist is Ferit Sandro Valentino, who is an architect based in Valletta and who has been practicing for 12 years. He spent the first 7 years of his career at Frisbee Rifa Architects, after which he co-founded Valentino Architects in 2015. The studio works on a variety of design-oriented projects of various scales, striving to manipulate space in order to improve people's quality of life by instilling beauty into the ordinary. So thank you all for joining us today. I would like to invite our audience to ask any questions in the chat, and we will dedicate some time after the discussion to answer these questions. So, in order to kick everything off, I would like to make a brief introduction about the survey which Thornton has carried out. So basically, the survey was conducted between the 9th and the 19th of June, around 500 responses were collected. From the survey, it resulted that 79% of the respondents feel comfortable visiting public open spaces, either during the summer months or in the coming months. So, well, if I may add, 79% is quite a high percentage. And so this brings me to my first set of questions, which are directed towards you, Dr. Conrad. It became very evident that due to the restrictions which were imposed upon us, with restaurants and other entertainment establishments being closed, many turned to open spaces during their recreational time. Do you think that the pandemic will change the relationship of the Maltese population with nature?
An interesting question. I don't generally like generalizations, I mean, about the Maltese population as a whole, but I think there's certainly something that is changing amongst the Maltese population. And I think this predates the pandemic as well. I think there's a growing kind of disquiet with the lack of open space, with the lack of opportunities to access nature. And I think that has been felt for quite a while. Maybe it's become a bit more obvious with the pandemic, because people obviously appreciated the open spaces that were available more, because their other options, as you said, were limited. And I think the pandemic also had the effect of maybe attracting certain people to nature who would normally not visit so much. So people maybe who are not aware that Malta actually has some countryside and some nature to offer, or people who maybe would ordinarily prefer other options for entertainment or for recreation. So I think in that respect, maybe it has brought a new segment of the population into some kind of contact with nature. Now, whether this is going to change our relationship with nature in the long term, I think that's a bigger ask. And I think if we are talking of sort of more long-lasting change, I don't really see that arising from just a few weeks or a few months of increased contact with nature. In part, I think, because people are quite set in their ways and in their habits, and that goes especially, I think, for adults. We tend to get used to our patterns of what we do and what activities we undertake, and I think we quickly kind of regress back to those once disturbance has happened. But I think if we want to talk of a new ethic, a new relationship with nature, what I would argue is that we really need to look at children, because that is where I see the potential for major change. I think we have a lot of background, a lot of literature, a lot of studies that have shown that if you really want to make changes, you need to make changes at the level of children, and not just in terms of teaching them about nature, but in terms of getting them out into nature, getting them to love nature, getting them to basically develop a relationship with nature that they can then use to basically develop a desire for nature, to engage in activities in nature later on in life. And so for more deep-seated change, I would say I don't think the pandemic is going to make that happen. But what I do hope is that it has at least put this at the forefront as a topic of conversation, that we need to talk about access to open spaces, we need to talk about access to nature on the countryside, and maybe we need to talk a lot more immediately, a lot more urgently about providing more access for people.
Thank you for that. So during this pandemic, nature has, so to speak, became a solution to our societal challenges. Is green infrastructure considered as an investment in health and quality of life?
I would say most definitely. I mean, like anyone else, I understand the importance of having a healthy economy. I think we all do. But I think we have reached a point, especially in Malta, where we need to think about the relationship between economic growth and quality of life. And I think we need to talk about the trade-offs that we have been making in terms of increasing economic growth, but a declining quality of life. And I think we can objectively just look around us and talk of things like crowding, congestion, traffic, the poor quality of certain built environments, even the lack of open spaces itself. I think they're all factors that certainly don't do any good to our quality of life. In fact, on the open space subject, years ago, this was already identified as a public health concern for Malta, and that there are various communities that basically lack access to open spaces. So I think we can objectively kind of say that we have had negative repercussions on our quality of life as a nation, and because of the economic progress we have seen. And I think it is certainly the time to start talking about investing in green infrastructure as at least one element that will help improve health and quality of life. Now, of course, investment follows a spectrum, so it can be, small interventions that already make a little bit of difference in neighborhoods, to much larger scale interventions that provide big spaces, parks, areas where people can truly interact with nature.
Okay, and in your opinion, what are the main benefits of connecting people to nature, and what evidence is there to support this interrelationship?
Oh, I think the evidence is plentiful, and again, it doesn't come from me. It comes from many years of studies, particularly in the field of environmental psychology, and medical sciences as well, that have shown basically that there are health benefits, physical health benefits, mental health benefits, and psychological benefits, emotional benefits, to spending time with nature, to having contact with nature. And there's also been work that shows even social ties, community ties, relationships benefits when you have spaces, natural spaces where people can interact. And of course, nature provides us with many ecosystem services. And we also have, I think, the flip side of this. We have a lot of work that shows what happens when you don't have contact with nature, when you don't have that connectedness with nature. We talk of things like urban stress nowadays. We kind of coined the term. We even talk of things like nature deficit disorder, because people's mental well-being, emotional well-being seems to be impacted by a lack of access and a lack of connectedness to nature. And if we want to talk about nature conservation as well and pro-environmental behavior, we also know that there is a relationship between how connected people feel to nature and their interest in actually protecting the environment. It is very hard to get people to care about the environment if they feel no connection with the natural world. So I think there is a lot of evidence that shows, years and years of evidence that show that nature is good for us. In very simple terms, nature is good for us. And we even have one term that is used often as biophilia, and that even people who argue that this is something that is intrinsic in human nature. As a human species, we are predisposed to actually have a need for contact with other forms of nature. And when we don't have that contact, we see the negative effects in terms of our health, the various facets of our health.
Okay, so this brings me to my next question. Do you think that as a highly urbanized nation, Malta can make sufficient accommodation for open spaces?
Well, I think Malta certainly has its challenges. I mean, we're small, the land is limited, and that is always a constraining factor. But I would say we absolutely have to. I don't think it's a matter of whether we should or whether we can or whether we can afford to. I think we must at this point. And it comes back to the quality of life. I think it is certainly doable because we can look at many cities, many dense cities in places around the world that still manage to provide open spaces, that still provide natural environments. So it certainly can be done. What I think it requires is maybe a more proactive, more strategic approach to land use planning. And I think, unfortunately, much of our land use planning in recent decades has taken place on a bit of a piecemeal basis. We get a permit here, a development there, and we don't really see the impact of everything on the whole. And it's not for lack of a strategic vision, because we've had many plans, many good plans that have tried to basically make sure that we're safeguarding the quality of the wider neighborhood and the wider landscape. But I think it's fair to say that sometimes those plans have been swept aside in the interest of expediency of various sorts. And that, I think, is a big pity, because one of the casualties for Malta, I think, has been the landscape, the quality of the landscapes in which we live. And I think an indicator of this as well is that Malta is one of the countries that actually signed the European Landscape Convention many years ago, but has never ratified this convention. And one of the aims of this convention is precisely to safeguard the quality of the environments in which people live. Not just outstanding places, not just the spectacular areas, but the everyday places where people live. So I think Malta certainly needs to do this, even though it's a highly urbanized nation, or maybe especially because it's a highly urbanized nation. We need to do this. And it needs to be done, I think, through an overhaul, a rethink of our land use planning system. And again, I would say objectively that this needs to be free of political interference from any party, from any side, to allow us to basically focus on land use planning as a technical pursuit that is really targeted towards preserving the quality of our living environments.
Thank you for that, Dr. Conrad. I will now turn to you, Ms. Michelle Borch. I think that we can all agree that green infrastructure is fundamental, but its effectiveness depends on good and proper design and implementation. Do you think that Malta now faces even more pressure for the need for open spaces?
Well, I think what Dr. Conrad has mentioned has already been like a sort of a prelude to my answer to this question. But coming from a perspective of land use planning, first and foremost, I think we should recognize again our size as Maltese islands. So our size is limited. We are what we are, 315 square kilometers. What we have today is a result of our historical, not 10, 15 years, but centuries that led to Malta's development patterns, let's say. And also, when urban planning was introduced, it's a relatively, let's say, young discipline in Malta, which met with a lot of, and still meets with a lot of resistance. It was introduced formally in 1992. let's say, in our recent history. So it's quite a young discipline. Urban planning as a public policy tool has to have guidance from the political direction, not the political as in great P, capital P, but what a government's policy direction for the country is. That's because planning is a public policy tool. However, it also reflects the values, I think, in my opinion, of the community that lives in that territory. So the way that the Maltese Islands have been developed, the idea to have home ownership, it's all sort of an underlying factor that we cannot forget when we try to plan for tomorrow. The need for open spaces has been felt even when we were monitoring the first plan, the structure plan. And it was felt that many local councils should have open spaces even in the urban area, not just the countryside, because countryside is there, and there are other issues with regards to visitor management and impacts in those areas. So in our current, let's say, strategic document, there is a call more than once for green open spaces. So in terms of national direction, on paper, let me say that, there is a strategic direction to call for green spaces, and this is since 2015, not because of COVID situation. There are also external pressures from external to Malta, again, pre-COVID, that are calling for countries to have green open spaces that are accessible to different community groups, let's say, within the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. There's a specific target, a specific measure on Target 11 that calls for green open spaces, accessible, safe, and especially for the elderly, women and children, etc. There's also now a huge impetus from the EU towards green infrastructure in general, and open spaces, not just as in the countryside itself, but even gardens, public spaces, to facilitate also the shift towards greater results, let's say positive results for biodiversity protection and also climate action. In addition to, this is the starting point where urban planning comes in with regards to open space. In addition to the fact that open spaces should be planned as part of all the other, let's say, infrastructure or uses within our own urban habitat, because that's where we live as humans. So there is pressure, or there are pressures, let's say, external and to Malta, that make us more sort of impose on us, let's say, or rather not impose, because we have agreed to those targets, require us to deliver more on this aspect. With the virus itself, the impacts of the pandemic, I think it gave more opportunity for people to reflect on their connection with nature. So now we have also another internal factor that was growing before the pandemic, where the public has become more aware for such spaces. But I think now, with this situation, it may help to get a moment, let's say, for action.
Okay, so in your opinion, given what we have just discussed now, what are the main problems which Malta faces with regards to open spaces or developing open spaces?
Okay, anyone who looks at maps or photographs even or aerial photographs of Malta, or anyone who likes to go around in their own community will appreciate, especially in highly urban areas, the limited availability of space. Now, what happened in the last few years also I must say, is that we have experienced a high rate of development, which led to a rapid increase in a very, very short period of time of urban densities. And even people were becoming shocked, let's say, because spaces in their communities, which were, let's say, open fields or open spaces themselves, which were previously designated for development in approved plans that were subject to public consultation, suddenly turning into developable spaces, or sort of into buildings. It started shocking everyone, I think, because change, they say change is as good as a risk, but a high rapid rate of change in a small, relatively small period of time, I think it created anxiety in all of us, and I include myself, because over time we started even losing landmarks in certain communities. So even the association of relating to a space, a place, started to be affected. And even without us registering it because we read papers or something else, that influenced us, and it brings me back to what Dr. Conrad was saying, to the impact of stress on the individual. So that's one element. The other fact is that there is limited open space available, because we have to consider, if land ownership is private, you have to ask the investor, what do you want? Open space or a development that renders income? If it is government, then it might be slightly different, the approach. But we have to acknowledge the reality of property ownership in Malta. There's also the issue, the challenge, and it's related to money, and it's related to this idea that we should shift our approach from our well-being and success being solely correlated to how much money we have in our banks or in our pockets. At the moment, and just today, it's been for a very long time, people value property in terms of the income, the real income it will bring back. Nobody translates that into, okay, this will mean more people in the community that have space to be relaxed, have moments where they can wind down, or less requests for sick leave. Less requests or pressures on our health systems. Again, in 2012, I think there was a strategy by the health department that called for open spaces. So there is also the other challenge, disjointedness. Do we have a common vision for the country, which then translated in all the departments working together to that common vision, will we keep working sort of in a silo approach? I think that's another challenge.
Okay, so following up on a point which you mentioned earlier, so public gardens are always sort of improving in terms of street furniture, but how can they be considered as effective green infrastructure, in particular for a person not to have to travel out of the urban core of a particular village or town and to go to the countryside in order to enjoy an open space?
I will focus on one key word so as not to take a lot of time. The function of the open space. So far, our traditional approach to gardens or open spaces has been paving, cementing, reducing the available green space or soil, and also having gardens as ornamental, something ornamental to look at. Or else to reduce them only for one particular group in society, like children, playgrounds only, or else related to, I don't know, tourism areas. I think it's time that we start thinking about multiple functions of gardens or open spaces. Should we have spaces where the public can sit on the grass, not just on benches? where you have groups of elderly sitting down in benches that are actually shaded by the trees, not lounged in bare sunlight. If our elderly population is growing and will continue to grow, in order for them to connect with others, if they're still, especially if they're still living in the community, and I think they should still live in the community, if they can, they could have these spaces where they can meet. You have shade, they can come out in the evening, and they could be safe. And you can have youths going there as well, with Wi-Fi connectivity. It's all about, this is beyond my remit now, it's all about thinking how to design these spaces to attract as much as possible different groups, even within different periods of the day.
Okay, so in your opinion, are policies which are currently in force inhibitors or enablers towards the realization of any goals that there may be following the pandemic?
Since 3 years ago, within the Planning Authority, we started to do our own homework and review our own policies to see whether they are enabling enough or not. Now, we have to remember that green infrastructure is a relatively new concept. So we focused on open spaces, greening of spaces, availability of spaces. Many local plans call for them. However, the concept of green space, again, to me, it looks like, or anyone who wants to read the plans themselves can see them as sort of pockets of greenery to alleviate the urban pressure, or to sort of a, let's say, ancillary to the urban design. In many instances, we have roundabouts as green open spaces. Who wants to go and sit in a roundabout? And these come from even older plans that Malta had pre-1992, because remember, our development policies are based on the plans that Malta had made, even in the 60s, which were called the provision schemes, which in 1988, Parliament adopted as sort of the urban area, the development zone for the Maltese Islands. And that's why I said in the beginning, we inherit what was in the past, and now we have to make do, not to make do with what we have, to understand the current situation and see how we want to transform it. So I here concur with Dr. Conrad, the need for a strategic approach, but which is more, let's say, again, in itself, looking at all aspects, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of well-being, in terms of health, in terms of where the society wants to go, where Malta and the Maltese residents want to go in the future.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, for that. I will now turn to you, Perit Valentino. What social or cultural benefits would green infrastructure emanate?
I think the question or the issue of green infrastructure needs to be seen on different scales. There's the macro scale, so on a national level, policy-wise, like we've been talking about, but even on a micro scale, so within our own homes. I think the sort of need to integrate with the natural landscape, for people to integrate with the natural landscape, was made very evident during this COVID quarantine, because, like Dr. Conrad said, everyone was flocking to the countryside, to make the most of the outdoor spaces we have. Perhaps they were not feeling connected enough to nature in the places where they lived. But the two obviously do not need to be, they are not mutually exclusive. I think we need to integrate the natural landscape within our built environment as much as possible. Also, I think people had the time while they were at home to think kind of critically about the spaces they live in. Are they sufficient? Do they satisfy our needs on a day-to-day basis? Is there enough light? Is there enough ventilation? Is there enough connection to the outside? So I think people started maybe to realize a little bit more, because they spent more time at home, the relationship between green infrastructure and quality of life. at the end of the day, which is what people need from their built environment. Benefits, I think, which could be achieved include creating spaces where people could go out and meet, and they could be little pockets. I mean, they don't need to be part of elaborate development plans. Pockets where people could meet outside of their homes to establish a bit of a sense of community. I think something we learn a lot from sort of our old village cores, places like Valletta, is that they've developed organically over time because of utility. It's what people needed at the time. But doing so, they've established spaces, community spaces, which I think what we're doing today lacks. I mean, the developments we're seeing today, which most of them I wouldn't even call development. It's not development, it's construction. There is no sense of community. I mean, you walk outside in a lot of these places and it feels like no man's land. This feeling you do not get in a place which has developed more organically over time. So I think what we are lacking in our urban areas today, we are trying to look for maybe in nature, but I think what we need to start doing is integrating the two. And it does not only come because it's easy for architects, developers, everyone to blame each other and point fingers at each other, saying about the planning authority lets me build this or the developer wants me to do that. I think it is our collective responsibility to include green spaces within what we build, within our front gardens, and obviously also within public open spaces. And I think the last point is also aesthetics. I mean, places become sustainable also if they are beautiful. No one wants to live in an ugly place. An ugly place kind of gets old and shabby. So there's also the issue about how green infrastructure and greenery is related to aesthetic sustainability, making places last longer. These ideas of integrating nature within architecture used to be used even for medical purposes. I mean, in the 1930s, to cure tuberculosis, people used to be sent to sanatoriums, which were beautiful buildings with big roof terraces which overlook the natural landscape, So it is clear, as my colleagues they have mentioned, that the presence of nature and open space is essential for people's well-being at the end of the day.
Okay, well, I believe that the issue of having an open space goes beyond than simply creating an open space within one area. So should we consider the aspect of open spaces and greenery also when designing roads?
The question of roads, I think even the requirements of roads today has also changed. Before, the road was kind of given to the car. Roads were built for cars because the private vehicle became more and more popular. Everyone started, first it was a luxury, but then everyone started owning their own cars. So roads were ultimately designed only for cars, where people would, in maybe more recent times, get into their car and switch on the air conditioner so they would be comfortable. But in reality, the surrounding landscape of the road became more and more uncomfortable. And today people are looking for, or at least we need to look for alternatives to the private vehicle, because it is evident that roads are clogged and there are too many vehicles on the road. So maybe people are walking more, people are starting to or would like to try to live closer to where they work so they can walk to work. People are using bikes a little bit more, scooters. So there is a bit of a more multimodal form of transport which is happening, a lot of which are using the same road networks, which might not really make sense. It's not safe maybe for a bike lane to be right next to a road. There should be, it should have its own network. So I think the requirements of roads are changing, and even the other requirements which do exist for roads also include things like waste collection. I mean, for example, now it's becoming a problem. You know, you walk out in the morning and in one corner of the road there's a massive pile of garbage bags. So roads are being used to store garbage until it's picked up. Very few developments, many times, especially the smaller scale ones, make a provision to make a little cupboard or something onto the street to store garbage bags in. So the roads have all these new functions today, so which are changing the physiognomy of roads, and not always for the better. So there are these complexities we need to start to consider, I think, when designing roads and road networks. Also, we need to start seriously considering which forms of transport access which areas of our urban, which urban zones are accessed by which forms of transport. Does it really make sense for cars to go right into the center of towns, you know, or right into the center of villages, or right into the center of Valletta? By doing that, automatically you're kind of eliminating or making it harder for other forms of transport to flourish in these areas, pedestrianization and all this sort of thing. So if slowly we start giving areas of towns and villages back to the pedestrian, back to be green and to become open, then yes, we can start integrating open spaces with our sort of road or transport network, which might not always obviously have to accommodate the car. And then there's also the issue of greening these spaces, I think. There are obvious examples of there are obvious benefits obtained when you green roads and plant trees along the roads. Environmental, collection of water, shade, shelter from rain, sheltering buildings from dust which is kicked off the road, shade, and all these things. So I think we do need to definitely start looking at the design even of roads as public space. You know, it's not something which is given to parked cars or moving cars only, but it's something which we need to start integrating a number of other factors, some of which I've mentioned in their design.
Okay, so this brings me to my last question. In your opinion, how should we tackle this cultural shift in thinking about such matters?
I think we definitely need to start to reassess how we value things, and how we value things like property, for example. Ms. Borge was talking about this earlier. We tend to sort of just apply, I don't know, rates per square meter, you know, when valuing an apartment, but that is not its real value. We need to start assessing places and the way we design them, of course, before they are built, based on more performative aspects. For example, light, environmental performance, comfort in many ways, thermal comfort, having some sort of connection to the outdoors, encouraging community and interaction. I mean, we don't necessarily have to build high walls around parts of our property, you know, because that does not encourage interaction between neighbors. I have in the past lived in sort of places which are newly built in Malta, where I had no idea who my neighbors were, and I also lived in other areas which are more historic and which have grown organically, where there is a sense of community. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way the places are designed. So I think reassessing how we value things and what we value and what we see as a successful development is very important. And I think it's also important to not to continue seeing developments as kind of standalone buildings with a dedicated use. I think it's important to keep on moving a bit away from thinking individually and selfishly, and thinking more about community, even the integration of different communities. For example, young children with old people, old people's homes, for example, providing public space within old people's homes where people from existing communities could go in and integrate with the people living there. Sometimes we tend to forget this part of society, you know, because they are grouped together in an area where they are sort of out of sight and out of mind. But I think the well-being of certain community groups needs to be seen and needs to be integrated with possibly also with existing communities. This is seen a lot. I mean, they're starting to explore it in other areas of Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, I believe, where they're even building schools and old people's homes within the same development. So the perception of the elderly for a child like that becomes completely different. You know, there isn't this stigma involved, and all these places, most of them are being designed obviously with sufficient open and green space where these different types of people could meet and come together. I think also little by thinking of small interventions in the way we design and build. For example, I think I may have mentioned this before, but the threshold between our private space and more public space. So what happens kind of in our front gardens and all this sort of thing? Should we just pave them and build a wall? Probably not. We should probably plant them, and we should probably make them a little bit more open, because that is the interface between where we live and kind of the streetscape and the people using the street. So whatever we do there has a direct effect on the people who belong to who live in the community. And I think we also, as architects, as developers, policymakers, we have a big role to play in this whole in the way things develop. I think we definitely need to work together more and also work together with existing communities, because I think what is happening also locally is that there is no real platform to present certain projects. They don't need to be big, but of maybe a more sizable scale to communities. So what's happening is, as soon as projects are submitted for permits, they are seen as negative immediately by existing communities, you know, because it's yet another construction project and yet another development. That is something I think we need to work on a lot, and we have a lot of responsibility socially to make sure that we start developing our built environment in a way which is sustainable and in a way which will benefit existing and future communities at the end of the day.
Thank you for it, Valentina, for all the interesting points which were brought up. I'm noticing that we have some questions from our audience, and the first question is directed towards you, Ms. Michelle Borch. So the question states, why is there no initiative at central government level to sort of acquire and preserve land in urban areas to be kept undeveloped for the benefit of the community?
That's a question that should be answered, and I'm not going to. I don't want to be seen as deflecting, but it's rather a question to be answered by the relevant authority, which is responsible for land ownership and estate management. However, I'd like to point out that as an authority, in recent years we had a fund where local councils could come and come up with their own project ideas, even for open spaces, in their communities, and receive funding from the planning authority, funds through fees that have been obtained via the permits. Unfortunately, not many of those proposals were targeted to the discussion that we're having today: open spaces, greening, open spaces in terms of green infrastructure, but more of, let's say, initiatives to provide furniture, let's say, garden furniture or playgrounds. However, in early June, the Development Planning Fund system has been rehauled, and I'm happy to say that we are taking an enabling role in proposing or supporting local councils and even NGOs to take up initiatives related to green infrastructure, in terms of open spaces in the community, specifically to provide service to the residents in the area. So the challenge now is we as an authority have taken the first step, not necessarily all the steps as yet. Now we need to understand how this initiative will be actually taken up. How many proposals are reaching us? How many proposals are being designed in that perspective? So in a sense, I'm sending an invitation to the participants here to look up this circular, and if they have interest in creating change within their own community, maybe they can reach their own local councils with their own ideas.
Okay, and another question which you have is one of our viewers is making a comment that many other countries require a space for dealing with domestic waste to be incorporated into development as part of their permit. So why does the planning authority not require this?
I come from the policy side, so I'm not involved directly in development permit conditions. However, I have to say that this is related to what we were saying before. Anybody who's going to develop their property, they want to maximize the traditional approach. I think as a Maltese population, it's a challenge for the regulator, the environmental regulator, our colleagues in ERA, for example, to ensure that waste separation is taken up both domestically and even commercially. I believe for certain projects, these issues are undertaken. However, more effort is required. When the request comes for such space to be required within the development site itself, the developer or the owner of the site wants to maximize the space for other uses. So this brings me to the question: are we planning, and what my colleagues were saying, are we planning for humans, or are we planning to have maximum real estate output from construction? So I think we need to think about that as well with regards to the.
Thank you for that. So in order to conclude, I would like each and every one of you to sort of summarize in 2 or 3 main points the discussion we just had today. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Conrad.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think I would focus on one main thing, which is that we need a more systemic approach. We need to look at the bigger picture, and I think these are points, very valid points that were brought up by my colleagues as well. I think we need to kind of zoom out, look at the system as a whole, and look at the big picture and address, as Ms. Borch said earlier, basically what do we want as a society? What do we want, and how do we make our land use planning system, our societal system, our open spaces part of that? And for that, as she also pointed out, I think a very important point, we need to address sort of the disjointedness that we have and how we approach these decisions at the moment. So I think my key point would be that if we can, let's try and work on adopting a more systemic perspective rather than looking at kind of small parts individually. Focus on the big picture and define a clear vision of what we want this country to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, and work on this as a joint effort across all entities.
Thank you. Ms. Michelle Borch.
Okay, my take, I see that the approach that we need to take is linked to this coordinated approach, and trying to find a purpose, a common purpose for the common good, which to me means allowing the technicals to assess the situation, work together with the entrepreneurs who want to invest, because they're the ones taking the risk to invest, and work with the community, with the public, in terms of listen to what they need. So on all of this, it's the biggest challenge, I think, for Malta. Thinking for the benefit of the community rather than my personal benefit first. All of us think of our own benefits as individual species, individual humans. But as a community, we depend on each other. So rather, and this is something that Perit Valentino mentioned, rather than hitting out against each other or calling each other that we have a better vision for Malta, why not sit together, think ahead, look at what challenges are coming in 20, 30 years, not for us, for our children, for grandchildren, and see how best to make use of this space, to make these islands enjoyable for us, first and foremost, as residents. And then the other benefits would be for tourists and visitors, etc. That's my take. Thank you.
Thank you, Perit Valentino.
I think we definitely need to start approaching development in a bit of a different way. And we need to start thinking a bit more about what our social responsibility is, and not only personal gain and monetary gain and success as seen in that way. And we need to think of future communities also. It's not about just the people who will inhabit these buildings we are building today, but also future generations who will ultimately experience them. So I think we need to start thinking a bit more selflessly than we have been in recent years. And we definitely need to, I think, establish platforms of dialogue. I think the process we follow today, when it comes to development of buildings, open spaces, whatever they may be, does not always paint a real picture of what we are trying to achieve, because submitting a bunch of boring drawings, online, which are technical and people cannot interpret, is not going to give them the right impression of what the project you are trying to design aims to achieve. So I think we definitely need to open up some form of dialogue between different stakeholders, which includes the community before the planning process and even during, because that will undoubtedly lead to better quality in the projects which we are building.
Thank you all for this fruitful discussion, and thank you for accepting our invitation to be part of this discussion. This brings us to an end to this webinar. I invite you to continue following other webinar series on the same page. I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.